Hi everybody, this is Coral Abbott with the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. Thank you so much for attending this webinar today. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to get logged on, and then we will begin the webinar probably at around 10:05. All right, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just logistically, if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat box if they're pressing, but we will have some time for Q&A at the end. And this webinar is going to be recorded, so if you have to drop off early or aren't able to stay, then there will be another option to watch it. So I am Coral Abbott. I am with the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program at the Strategic Growth Council. Today we're going to be talking about round 5 of the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program. So to give a quick outline of the day of this webinar, we're going to be going over just the basics of the program for those of you that are new to it, our threshold requirements, both the ones that have already existed through the rounds and the ones that are new in particular for this round. Then we're going to be going over the scoring criteria and key topics. That includes the new scoring criteria for round 5. We are going to then be going over the application. Our colleague at the Air Resources Board is going to be going over the benefits calculator tool that is a part of the overall application. And then we'll be covering the application review process, where to find additional resources on the program to help guide you through the application process. And then we will also have an opportunity for Q&A at the end for some of those more specific questions. So to give a timeline of where we are at in the program, some of you may have been involved in the draft kind of iteration of the guidelines, and apologies, these should all say round 5. It's a little oversight. But basically we went through a public comment period, released a draft of the guidelines, went through another public comment period, and released our final round 5 guidelines on October 21st, and they were adopted by the Strategic Growth Council at the October 31st council meeting. And we actually intended to have the application released, but that's going to be released, we believe, tomorrow or sometime this week. We apologize for the delay on that. And then we are kicking off our workshops in the next couple of days. We'll be officially hitting the road tomorrow, although this, of course, is a workshop as well. So that will begin the application period once the NOFA and application are out. Applications will be due again this year on February 11th of 2020, with award recommendations being released in June and then adopted probably 10 days later at the June 2020 Strategic Growth Council meeting. And this keeps to the annual schedule. This will be now our 3rd round of staying on this cycle. So just as a kind of setting the stage for what AHSC is about, this program is really focused primarily on curtailing greenhouse gas emissions. And it is a housing and transportation program, but the way this fits in is you can see in this chart on the left-hand side, that column is emissions from the transportation sector in California. And that first huge component is passenger vehicles. So that is the piece that AHSC is really trying to tackle, is getting at how much individuals are driving their personal vehicles around the state to get everywhere they need to go. So the question of why we drive so much, particularly in California, is that there's a lack of location efficient housing. So there might be a lot of jobs in one place, but not a lot of housing opportunities in that same location. So folks have long commutes. Could be similar with other destinations that folks need to go day to day, and a lack of quality low carbon transportation options. So there might not be really viable, accessible transportation options to get to those destinations. So AHSC deals with that in a specific way. We fund infill projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled through sustainable land use, housing, and transportation practices. So that means bringing together the worlds of affordable housing and transportation, funding both of those in tandem with each other in an integrated way. So to date, the program has been through 4 rounds, and we've funded 101 projects totaling approximately $1.1 billion across the state. So this has resulted in 8,932 affordable units, more units if you add into those the market rate units that have been funded, 2.2 million metric tons of CO2 emissions avoided, and 81 of the projects benefit disadvantaged communities, as defined by Cal and Virus Green. So what does this program actually fund? The first component of that, and the one that many come to the program for, is the Affordable Housing Development Loan. So this is the construction loan for kind of the brick and mortar construction of your affordable housing development. And then there's housing related infrastructure. This comes in the form of a reimbursable grant. Anything that's required as a condition of approval for the housing development can be funded through this category. So it can be water, sewer, electric, but it can also be if you're required to build out roads for the development or something like that, HRI will pay for that as well. Then we have sustainable transportation infrastructure, again in the form of a reimbursable grant. This funds capital infrastructure like transit vehicles, bike lanes, and sidewalks that enable mode shift, and new for this round, transit operations. So the actual operational costs needed, and we'll get into that a little bit more in detail, what the parameters of that are. Then there's transportation related amenities. Again, comes in the form of a reimbursable grant. This is anything that makes folks feel safer, makes it easier, more comfortable to use alternative transportation modes. So that can be bike parking, repair kiosks for bikes, urban greening like street trees along a bike path. Bus shelters is a really popular one there. And then we have our eligible program costs. So the first of these is active transportation programs. And we'll get into it later a little bit what those can look like, but these are really focused on any programming that makes it easier or safer to use active transportation. That can be bicycle repair workshops, it can be a walking school bus, anything of that nature. And then we have transit ridership programs. That is anything that makes it easier for folks to use transit. So that can be kind of an educational workshop on how to use the local transit system. Popular in this section is transit passes being provided to residents of the overall community, not just residents of the affordable housing development, which is a requirement. And then we have air pollution reduction programs. These are focused on educating folks about how to reduce exposure to local pollutants. And then we have workforce development programs. That's pretty straightforward. Related to the project itself, you can put in workforce development program. And then low income car share. So this isn't actually new, but it is clarified for this round that program costs for low income car share for your affordable housing development are eligible. And this is really focused on the operational costs of that. It's not paying for the vehicles themselves, but it will fund part of the operations. So because California is such a large state, we split our project area types into 3 different sections. First of these is transit-oriented development. These are areas that have what we call high quality transit, which is headways of 15 minutes or more and fixed infrastructure. So that can be like light rail subway, or it can be bus only lane. To qualify for TOD, and specifically, there has to be a stop for a high quality transit station within a half mile of your affordable housing development. So for this section, or for this project area type, you're required to build in high quality, build in an affordable housing development. And new for this round, there's a requirement that 50% of the funds go towards the combination of affordable housing and or housing related infrastructure. So additionally, these project area types are required to build in at least one of the additional program components. So the affordable housing development and sustainable transportation infrastructure, transportation related amenities, or programming costs. We will say for competitiveness reasons, we tend to see sustainable transportation infrastructure, specifically some sort of transit improvement, in almost every project that we funded in the last 2 rounds, and particularly in round 4. There's a required minimum density of 30 units to the acre, although the average or the median density for the TOD projects was significantly higher last round. I believe it was around 150 units per acre as the median density, and that plays into competitiveness as well, which we'll cover later. And then we have our integrated connectivity project area types. These are areas that have qualifying transit, and this means that the transit maybe doesn't have really frequent headways, it doesn't have fixed infrastructure, but it's still, a solid bus line, there's a bus stop, it doesn't have a bus only lane, and that has to be within a half mile of your housing development. Notable for this section is that if you're building a qualifying transit stop in as a part of your project, that can still qualify, whereas with TOD, you have to have high quality transit at the time of application in order to be categorized as TOD. So the ICP project area types have to have 50% of the funds going towards affordable housing and or housing related infrastructure. So that is new this year, that ICP projects are required to have a housing development. And they also must have a sustainable transportation infrastructure component, as well as at least one additional component of either transportation related amenities or programs. There's a required minimum density of 20 units to the acre here. We tend to see, in the last round, I believe we saw a median of around 50 units per acre for this project area type. And then we have the rural innovation project area. These also are required to have qualifying transit, similar to ICP. The difference is that they qualify as rural using the same definition as TCAC. So for consistency, we have the same definition and methodology to determine whether a project is rural. Again, new, 50% of funds to affordable housing and or housing related infrastructure is now required, as well as sustainable transportation infrastructure. And you must build in at least one additional component, a transportation related amenities or programs. There's a required minimum density of 15 units to the acre, and for this project area type, we do see around 15 to 20 units to the acre as kind of a standard, although we have seen outliers. So I'm gonna skip ahead and go back to the last one. We use these categories to kind of determine how much funding we're targeting. So we have an initial setup that 35% of the funding is targeted to TOD. And this year, 45% of the funding will be targeted to ICP, which is an increase from 35% last round. A 10% target for the rural innovation project area type. And that leaves 10% as a remainder of discretionary funds that are to be determined by the council. These are to help meet any program priorities. Importantly, to meet any statutory set-asides. So we have 2 statutory set-asides within the program. 50% of our funds must be located within disadvantaged communities and 50% must go towards affordable housing. And then any priorities of the council themselves, whether they see any projects that fit a specific criteria that they would like to fund that hasn't been included in that initial 90%. So going back to our funding amount, what this actually kind of breaks down into numbers, we are one of the few fortunate California climate investment programs that has funding until 2030. So the California climate investments are all funded through California's cap and trade auction proceeds. And the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program gets roughly 20% of the proceeds from each auction. So for round 4, our last round, this equated to $400 million and brought us to 1.1 billion in total funding. And then in round 5, this is going to bring us to around 550 million for just this round alone. So there's quite a bit of funding in round 5 because of recent auction proceeds being very strong. So we believe we'll be able to fund quite a number of projects. Something I should point out is that in round 4, it says minimum award of 1 million, maximum award of 20 million. For round 5, we've increased the maximum award amount to 30 million, which we'll get into a little bit more further in the presentation. So there are a number of eligible applicants. Local governments play a very important role, as well as either a developer or a housing authority, as well as transit agencies or operators. We tend to see that combination of some sort of local government playing a really important role in the kind of active transportation scope, working with the transit agency on any transit improvements, and then working with the entity in charge of the housing to build that affordable housing component. So it's very focused on partnership. As I mentioned earlier, we have a couple of statutory set-asides. The first of those is that 50% of the available funds must go towards affordable housing. So that includes any AHD or HRI costs, and that's actually why we put in those new requirements on the minimum amount of funding that has to go towards housing in every project. And then we also have a requirement that 50% of the available funds must go towards disadvantaged communities, which I will explain in just a moment. So this is a map of California with an overlay of CalEnviroScreen 3.0, which basically looks at a number of indicators surrounding health, pollution burden, and kind of ranks each census tract in the state. And the top 25% most impacted communities are what we consider disadvantaged communities. We don't have any scoring requirements around disadvantaged communities. We hit those targets naturally. So your project does not need to be located in a disadvantaged community in order to be eligible for this program, just an important note. And it doesn't, you don't receive extra points for being located in a disadvantaged community. So this is our favorite graphic in the program that we like to show to kind of demonstrate what this can look like and demonstrate that it's not a program just focused on a single infrastructure component, but really looking at the integration of all of them together to create more livable communities. So the first, obviously, keystone of the project is affordable housing, but then there are bike lanes that connect the affordable housing down to the school in the bottom left corner. There are pedestrian pathways that connect over to the grocery store and over to the bus, expanded bus routes, either capital or operations available now for that. Bus shelters for folks to wait at, sidewalks, greening. So we have a couple of project examples. The first of these is the Florence Neighborhood Mobility Project. This is a TOD project in the county of Los Angeles. It is in a disadvantaged community. There are 108 affordable housing units for 30 to 60% of area median income. 100% affordable density at 117 units to the acre. So this is that TOD project area type with really high density. And 54 of the units are set aside for those at risk of homelessness. It also contains a workforce development center. And the transportation services included in the application were extensive bikeway and walkway improvements through the project area. And they also created a walking path in a local park to enhance stormwater capture, which is a great component. This project received around $7 million for the affordable housing component, roughly $3 million for the transportation infrastructure, $600,000 for the transportation-related amenities, and $127 roughly thousand for program costs. And then we have the Arrowhead Grove project. This is an ICP product, so it had qualifying transit, but not high quality transit. It is also in a disadvantaged community. It provided 147 affordable housing units for 30 to 60% area median income. It is at 80% affordability, so 20% of the units are market rate. It includes a community center with social services for residents. The transportation included bikeway and walkway improvements, including a half mile of safe and accessible walkways that connects the housing to a local elementary school. This project received the full $20 million, with $17 million going towards the housing component and the remainder going towards sustainable transportation infrastructure and programming costs. So this is our rural project example. It's in the city of Lamont, which is a low-income community within half a mile of a disadvantaged community. Provided 42 bedroom units for families making between 30 to 50% of the area median income, 100% affordable, 22 units to the acre, so pretty good density for a rural project. And it is a net zero energy building. They included extensive sidewalk and bikeway improvements, as well as active transportation improvements along the major roadways in order to connect the community across that major roadway. This project received a little over $8 million, with $6 million going towards the housing and the remainder going towards sustainable transportation infrastructure, transportation-related amenities, and program costs. So most of those eligible costs categories were covered in this project. And getting into now how to be fully eligible for the program. We have 25 total threshold requirements in our guidelines, so they're pretty high barrier here to make sure that these projects both fit the goals of the program and are really shovel ready is what they're looking at. Some of the really key project requirements are that you demonstrate greenhouse gas reductions by reducing vehicle miles traveled. All of our projects do this by the basic design of the program. And then your affordable housing development, wherever that is located, there has to be a transit station or stop within a half mile of that, like I mentioned. And you can build that in as part of the project if you don't currently have one for the ICP and RIPA categories. And a very important one that we have to remind folks of sometimes is that project construction has not commenced as of the application deadline. So this is a pretty popular topic this year. It's 4%, 9% tax credits. Per our guidelines, a single affordable housing development may not include more than one affordable housing development, nor may it include an affordable housing development that contains multiple development sites when one site is receiving 4% low-income tax credits and another is receiving 9% tax credits. So if you're going to pursue this scenario, you would be required to submit separate applications. And each of those applications would have to have distinct transportation scopes. So like I mentioned, something pretty important is that we're looking for shovel-ready projects. And what this translates into is some of our thresholds, like having environmental clearances in hand for affordable housing developments, having all discretionary land use approvals, demonstration of site control. The developer has to have experience constructing 2 projects of a similar scope and size in the past. There can't be active or pending litigation against the project. Your jurisdiction has to be in compliance with its housing element, and there is a committed funding threshold as well. And then we have a number of thresholds that cover our programmatic goals. So as was stated earlier, demonstrating a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, implementing your sustainable community strategy for your region, so working with your MPO to demonstrate that you are helping to implement that vision. Ensuring preservation of agricultural land, so not building on agricultural land, including 2 urban greening components, providing transit passes for residents of affordable units. Buildings must be smoke-free. There has to be adequate lighting for public spaces, and we do have an affordability threshold as well. So really just to hit this home, qualifying transit must be completed and offering service to the transit station or stop no later than the issuance of the certificate of occupancy for the affordable housing development. So this is for those ICP or RIPA projects that don't currently have qualifying transit. If you're building it in as a part of the project, it has to be in place at the same time as the housing development itself. Our requirements for transit passes is that you're required to provide at least 1 pass per restricted unit for at least 3 years, a minimum of 40 commute rides per month. So that can be an unlimited free pass, it can be a discounted pass, or it can be a reloadable transit card. If you're doing discounted passes, it has to be at least 50% discounted, and that will be covered by the AHSC grant. You are rewarded in our benefits calculator tool that is looking at avoided emissions for providing a larger subsidy. So it can be to your benefit to increase it above 50%. And these costs don't contribute to the $500,000 program cost caps that we have. So this is if you are, for whatever reason, requesting $500,000 in transit passes for residents of your affordable housing development, you will have additional funds available to fund other programs. Our enforceable funding requirement is that the project has to demonstrate a level of committed funding at the time of application that is 0.9 or greater, calculated by the following equation. So whatever funds you're requesting from the program, plus the enforceable funding commitments, less any deferred costs, over the total development costs minus the deferred costs. So really this is looking at you have to have 90% of your funding in place, including whatever you're asking for from AHSC. So you can have 45% from other sources, 45% that you're requesting from AHSC, and you will meet that threshold. Our affordability requirements are that at least 20% of the units have to be affordable units. We have an also additional requirement that those affordable units have to have an average affordability of at least 50% of area median income. So it can be 50% or lower for what we will consider affordable. So for example, a 20-unit project with units restricted to 40% and 60% AMI, you would calculate the average affordability by taking 10 units at 40%, 10 units at 60%, and that averages you out to 50%. So we only consider projects that go up to 60% of AMI to be affordable. So that's important for your calculations as well. The exception that we have to this is that homeownership projects may go up to an average of 80% of area median income for all restricted units. So our agricultural land preservation threshold says that the project must not result in a loss or conversion of agricultural or working lands. And you can use the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Program tool to verify this. So that there is a tool through the Department of Conservation to see whether your project is on agricultural land. This tool uses data that may be a few years old. So if you know for a fact that this is no longer agricultural land, we have an exception. If you can prove that it is an infill project, and this is that either 3 of the 4 sides or 75% of the perimeter, if you kind of have a funky shaped parcel, have to be developed with qualified urban uses. So our environmental clearance requirement, the affordable housing development and the housing related infrastructure components of your project has to demonstrate environmental clearance by time of application, but the time period for filing appeals or lawsuits can lapse within 30 days of the application due date. So you have until, I believe, March 13th for that filing period to lapse. And then the transportation components of projects have until initial grant disbursement to demonstrate environmental clearance. So there's a longer runway on those components. Air pollution, our requirement on this one is that you have to have compliance with state building code, so it's not too groundbreaking, which requires MERV 13 filtration in all new housing. We additionally require outreach and education on reducing health impacts to residents of affordable housing developments. And we encourage folks to consult with their local health department, many of which are already doing work in this field, to think about what those outreach and education efforts could look like. It does benefit you to go above and beyond the threshold, as we have points available in the narrative scoring section on addressing this component further. And now I'm going to be passing it off to Ryan Silver, my colleague, to discuss the scoring.
Hi, everybody. This is Ryan Silver. I'm also with the Strategic Growth Council, working on the AHSC program. As Coral mentioned, I'm going to be walking through the scoring components. So within AHSC, there are 100 points available, and these points are used to award projects on a competitive basis. That breakdown works out into 3 different categories. The first being greenhouse gas reductions as calculated through the AHSC benefit calculator tool, which we'll get into a little bit more detail about later on. We also have 55 points available for quantitative policy scoring, and then 15 points available for narrative-based policy. Within the program, we see a whole range of scores, but we never actually see a perfect 100. The intent is to try and score as many points as possible, as it is a highly competitive program, though we don't expect that any single project is able to complete all of the individual scoring components. The first scoring category, these GHG reductions, are calculated as parts of 2 individual criteria that both rely upon those estimated GHG reductions as calculated through the AHSC benefits calculator tool available on the CARB website. The first is the total estimated reduction. So this is just the total number that results from all of your AHSC project components. The second aspect are the efficiency of those reductions, or rather the total GHG reductions divided by the AHSC funding request. Each of these 2 categories are worth 15 points apiece. The way that points are awarded are on a competitive curve, or what we call binning. So there's 5 different bins, with the top 5th of projects receiving 15 points and the bottom 5th, or the last 20% of projects, receiving 3 points. And so that works in both the efficiency scoring and the GHG scoring. So if your project receives or has within the top 20% of GHG reductions for its project area type, then it will receive 15 points. And if it's in the top 40%, but not the top 20% of the efficiency of reductions, then it will receive 12 points in the efficiency bin for a total of 27 points. One thing to note is your binning is calculated according to your project area type. So all TOD projects will be ranked against each other, all ICP against each other, and all RIPA projects against each other. So there will be top scoring projects within each of those categories. Our next section is our quantitative policy scoring. 55 points, this is the largest scoring component of AHSC. This approach or this scoring category can be treated with a checklist type approach where it's the category you'll have the most certainty about your final score. AHSC program staff will review that score and then send you an initial score letter, and during that process you'll have a time to appeal any findings or changes to that score. But you should have a fairly good idea about the competitiveness of your application based on this category. Our median score in here is about a 45, but we see ranges between the low 50s and the mid 30s. Just as with the total scoring, the intent is not for projects to receive 100% of the points, though every point is definitely a bonus and should absolutely be pursued. So now just going to get into a breakdown of each of these 55 points and give a little detail as to how to score each of them. So you'll notice red text within the following slides. This is to signify an area that's changed since the round 4 guidelines. So for those of you familiar with the program, you'll notice something different here. Our active transportation scoring is worth 10 of these 55 points. Context sensitive bikeways. So depending on the length of the improvements being proposed in the AHSC project, any project that proposes over half a mile of bikeway improvements, according to our context sensitive bikeways definition, which depends on the average daily traffic of the roadway, will receive 2 points. Bikeway improvements that are less than half a mile are eligible for 1 point. The network bicycle connectivity. So this is a revised point from last round. This used to be our key destination linkages. How this point is scored now is that any project that is proposing bicycle improvements that link the affordable housing development or the transit stop directly to an existing bicycle network or to a bicycle network that's been identified in local planning documents, that project is eligible for 1 point. That existing or planned bicycle network does not have to meet our definitions of context sensitive bikeways. So it can be existing bike lanes that, as I mentioned, do not meet the context sensitive definition. The bicycle network gap closure is 1 point for each improvement that closes a gap in a bicycle network. So this could be a safety hazard, something that's addressed by traffic calming measures or increasing visibility. So 1 point for each gap closure for a maximum of 2 points. Safe and accessible walkway improvements. This is now eligible for 2 points rather than in previous rounds where it was 3 points. So any project that proposes over 2,000 feet in safe and accessible walkways is eligible for these 2 points. 1,000 feet to 2,000 feet is eligible for 1 point. And please refer to our guidelines for how these safe and accessible walkway distances are measured, as there are distances eligible just for replacement or improvements of sidewalks and not necessarily brand new sidewalks. The pedestrian network connectivity point, this point used to be our key destination linkage. So within this pedestrian network connectivity, the point can be earned here by linking 2 previously disconnected pedestrian networks. And that can be done through a crossing that is not at grade, or essentially an underpass or overpass, I'll give an example on the next slide of what this really looks like. And finally, our pedestrian network gap closure is similar to the bicycle network gap closure. If there's an existing barrier to access for pedestrians that's addressed, that is worth 1 point up to a maximum of 2 points. So here is this pedestrian network gap closure, just an example of what it would look like. So if you refer to those 2 blue dots, you can see that there's a pedestrian bridge over the highway that is linking those 2 pedestrian networks or sidewalk networks. If that pedestrian bridge was not there and instead it was proposed through an AHSC project, it would then be eligible for that 1 point. Because you can see that that red line is the nearest walkable route to then link those 2 pedestrian networks. And that red line actually amounts to more than a quarter mile, which is what qualifies for 2 unlinked pedestrian networks in this AHSC program. So building that pedestrian overpass would then earn this 1 point. Other examples you might think of could include a canal that needs crossing, or an underpass over a raised highway. So green buildings and renewable energy, these are worth 8 points within the AHSC guidelines. So you can refer first to our energy efficiency graph. If your project implements any of these 3 green rating systems for its residential components, as verified by a certified energy rating professional, then that project's eligible for 3 points. If you refer to our guidelines, we also have options for commercial components that make these points eligible. And in the bottom right-hand portion, we offer up to 5 points for on-site renewable energy at the project. So on-site geothermal or solar panels, but this doesn't include procuring through your general energy provider off the grid. So up to 5 points available for a zero net energy development, and 1/3 of a point, or sorry, 2 points available if at least 1/3 of the building's energy is produced on site. So this would account for both electric and gas usage of the development, though wouldn't take into account energy from the from water drawn from the site. So housing, transportation, collaboration, previously worth 10 points, is now worth 9 points in these round 5 guidelines. So that first graph or chart in the top right portion of the slide, this chart details the 6 points available for requesting STI funds as represented by your total AHSC funding request. So the amount of STI funds requested divided by your AHSC total funding request, if that is 25% or more, your project's eligible for 6 points, and then a couple less points depending on the ratio. If your project is requesting TRA funds, similar to the STI percentage, the total of your TRA funds of your AHSC funding request, if it's 5% or more, that's eligible for 1 point. If that 5% is located at a single transit stop or station, then that would increase to 2 points. So if you think of a major transit station or transit hub improvement, that would essentially be how to get those, or that extra point. And then this final category, these 2 points, or these 2 items here separated by the or, used to be 2 individual points. In the round 5 guidelines, you can fulfill either of these criteria for a single point. So projects with funding from another greenhouse gas reduction fund program or a cap and trade or climate change investment program, they're all synonyms, that directly benefit the project. That is one way to get this point. And then the project within an environmentally cleared high-speed rail station area, that is a second way to get that point. So location efficiency and access to destinations, there are 2 scoring criteria within this category. The first is for the walkability index of where your project is located. So if you follow the guidelines, there is a link to the US EPA walkability index. Depending on what that score is, then there's up to 3 points available within AHSC. Key destinations within the project area. So we'll go a little bit later into how to define that project area. But if there are 9 of these 11 key destinations in the project area, you are maxing out on points in your application. So up to 3 points, 1/3 of a point for each of the key destinations. One thing to note is these key destinations will be considered only once. So once you have a public park in your project area, a second public park will not get you an additional 1/3 of a point. So this is down from 1/2 a point in previous rounds to now just 1/3 of a point. We did this because you'll notice those red highlighted key destinations were newly added to this key destination definition. What we did here is align our key destinations with our activity centers, which are located within the AHSC benefits calculator tool. So now activity centers and key destinations, those two definitions are the same. Something that some of you from previous rounds might now notice. Our funds leveraged. So what was previously 5 points within this category is now worth 4 points for projects that have enforceable funding commitments represented as a total of your AHSC funding request or as a ratio. So if your project is requesting $20 million and you bring in $40 million in enforceable funding commitments, that project is leveraged by 200% and is eligible for that maximum of 4 points. The category that was dropped off from previous rounds was 25% to 49% of leverage funds. AHSC is really stressing that we would like to see more leverage projects in future rounds. So we eliminated that lowest criteria. Anti-displacement strategies are worth a total of 5 points within the guidelines, broken out into 2 separate categories. The first being for anti-displacement strategies for local community residents. Within the guidelines, there's a number of different criteria that are eligible for this category or for these points. Excuse me. With 1 point available for each of the different criteria. There are certain criteria that are only eligible to be implemented by the applicant and other criteria that are only eligible to be implemented by the local jurisdiction. That's just based on the ability for state evaluating staff to really ensure that those criteria or those anti-displacement strategies will be followed through on if there's a certain criteria of which we're not able to verify that the applicant themselves will be able to do so. These categories or these strategies have been modified from previous rounds, so I encourage you to take a closer look. They look different, but most of the same strategies from previous rounds are still there. There is one category, it's our longest bullet point within the list, that captures a number of different strategies. This one bullet point, as it notes within the guidelines, is eligible for multiple points if there are multiple strategies within that list being implemented. In addition to the resident anti-displacement, there's also 2 points available for anti-displacement strategies for locally owned businesses. So you can refer to the guidelines for a list of what those strategies would be. A newly added scoring criteria this round are pro-housing local strategies. So up to 2 points available for this category. These pro-housing strategies are or will be implemented by the local jurisdiction and not by any private or nonprofit developer. So this is something that will be happening within the jurisdiction itself. And there's 5 possible different scoring categories paraphrased up here and 1 point per strategy. So if you look within our AHSC application, which will be posted in just later this week, you'll see that we're going to be asking for verification of where that ordinance is located or where that program is located online and an excerpt from it so that we can go and verify that these strategies will be in place. This is part of a soft rollout of pro-housing strategies that's going to be implemented across the Transforming Climate of Communities and Infill Infrastructure grant programs, which currently have this category in the same manner AHSC does. But in the future, the Department of Housing and Community Development will issue its own rating system of categories or of jurisdictions that are pro-housing or deemed pro-housing. At that point, we will be referring to that rating system rather than asking our applicants to submit their own verification of these strategies. We also have 2 points available for workforce development and hiring practices. A couple examples of what those could look like include partnering with a workforce development agency or instituting local hire policies. We also have 5 points available for targeting units with extremely low income affordability requirements. So if a project has 20% or more of its units dedicated, or if it's restricted units dedicated to extremely low income units, then that would be worth 5 points, scaling down according to the percentage of those restricted units, which are for extremely low income residents. We also have 2 points available for programs. So the first point for instituting an eligible program, you can see our 5 eligible program uses on the left. One thing to note is that if a project is proposing transit passes as its eligible program use for this point, those transit passes must be offered to at least as many community residents as are being offered to residents in the affordable housing development. And then a second point is available for programs that are going to be extended beyond our AHSC grant term, or can show that they will be funded beyond our AHSC grant term, which is 3 years, so funded beyond 3 years. And finally, we have our urban greening category. So projects that are proposing $200,000 or more in urban greening are eligible for 2 points, and then 1 point is available for projects in between $100,000 and $200,000 in urban greening. And our final scoring category is our narrative-based policy scoring. So this is a scoring category for some of our criteria, which are a little more qualitative and harder to evaluate on a checklist basis. So how we review these scores are all projects that score at least half of the points available in quantitative policy and GHG scoring, or all projects that score at least 42.5 points are eligible or will move on to the narrative category. We then send our narratives, the project narratives, to panels of subject matter experts, who then will review all of the narrative sections across all AHSC projects. So they'll have seen all the collaboration planning or all the climate resiliency sections across every project to ensure they have consistency, and then reach a consensus score through mediated deliberation. These scores cannot be appealed, which is something to note, whereas our quantitative policy and GHG scoring scores are eligible for appeal. So we have a couple different resources to assist with you all in determining how to write your narrative-based policy. First off, within the guidelines themselves, there are a few resources that point you towards air pollution mitigation or climate resiliency resources. We also post our scoring rubric on the SGC website. This I would recommend absolutely looking at before you write your narrative, as it is followed through the scoring process. You can also refer to past project scores on the SGC website and actually read their narratives through the FAST application portal. And that FAST portal is available, or instructions on how to access it are available on the SGC AHSC resources page as well. So this first category is collaboration and planning. The goal here is to identify local planning efforts that the project will be based off of, and also explain the collaboration between local agencies that were involved in creating the project, and describing the role they had in envisioning the project across each of its different components, and what the collaboration in that process was that led to the development of the project. So specificity in calling out the specific aspects of the project in a local plan rather than a general plan is important in this category. Also clearly laying out those roles of what each of those local agencies did in bringing that project's vision together. Those are two important notes for this category. Our community benefits and engagement category is our largest scoring section in the narrative. And its goal is for you all to be able to describe how the community and community-based organizations have been meaningfully involved in bringing this project together from early on and throughout the development. There are a couple of resources available on the AHSC website, one notably being the Community Engagement Tracker, which is an Excel document that allows you all to describe the outreach that's been done in the community engagement that's been done in envisioning the AHSC project. So any workshops, meetings, surveys can be included within there to give a little bit more detail as to how thorough the community engagement was done and the quality of that community engagement. So something to note here is that you can use specific plans or community plans as a framework or a foundation for this section, but we are hoping to see some detail related to the project specifically, or if you do use those specific plans, really linking those plans to the project to make it clear that this project is rooted in the vision of that plan, of which the community really had a voice in. Our community climate resiliency, this is an opportunity for you all to describe how the project itself is designed and prepared for a future in which the impacts of climate change will be increasingly realized. One thing that we added this year is an adaptation assessment matrix, which provides you all a tool in which to list your different climate impacts that are going to be expected for the project area, and then gives a list of different mitigating measures that could be taken for those different impacts. For example, extreme heat, you could list the different insulation or values within the affordable housing development, but you could refer to that tool for a full list of those suggested measures, which are not all inclusive. But this section, within writing the narrative and using the adaptation matrix, the adaptation matrix is really there to help identify the vulnerabilities and possible adaptation measures. The narrative response itself is an opportunity for you all to describe how the adaptation measures really mitigate the climate impacts to be expected, and do so over the full time span of the project, reaching out into the next century. And it's important to consider adaptation for the project area and not just the housing component, as the project will be including improvements beyond just the housing. And the final narrative scoring category is for air pollution exposure mitigation. So this is to identify different air pollution sources within the project area and describe what strategies will be used to mitigate that exposure to the residents in the project area. So really a key here is to focus on the community and their exposure, not exposure specifically just in the housing development itself. So while things related to protection within the affordable housing development are great, we are looking to the greater community. and how design of the project is really going to benefit community residents by protecting them from existing air pollution exposure. And there are some resources posted in our guidelines on effective measures of air pollution exposure mitigation. So just going to cover a couple of key topics here. So as Coral mentioned, being part of a disadvantaged community or a low-income household is not an eligibility criteria, but we do ask that you all identify whether or not your project is within one of these areas. And there's a link to this criteria table within the AHSC application. It looks a bit confusing, but essentially what we're asking for you all is to reference the priority populations map provided by California EPA, and you can see whether or not your project area, whether or not that address is within a low-income community, within a disadvantaged community, or within a low-income community that's within 1.5 mile of a disadvantaged community. Employment reporting. So newly instituted last round, employment reporting is required in round 5 of all AHSC awardees. So there's 2 aspects to this, one being a basic model based off of the project's budget, and then the second being actual outcomes-based reporting. So once your project starts construction, then we'll be asking that you report on the couple different metrics, including the number of jobs, the total hours, average wages, and benefits provided to the workers. So this is just for awarded projects and will be done after award is made. Something new to round 5 is AHSC now has a tribal funding target. What this means is that if a project is fully eligible and meets all of our eligibility criteria, that from a tribal applicant, that project will be awarded. So that tribal projects are eligible as any 3 of our project area types. So this would contribute to any of those project area type funding targets as well. If we receive more than 1 tribal funding application, the top scoring tribal target will be used to meet this funding target, though all the rest of our tribal projects will just be subject to the normal AHSC scoring or awards process. Our maximum funding amounts. So as Coral also mentioned, our funding or our maximum award size increased to $30 million, up from $20 million this round. We did this in order to match the maximum loan increases seen in other HCD funding sources, so that if a project's applying to AHSC and also wants to apply to other HCD programs, the size of the loan request could be consistent across each of these programs. To match this, we also are increasing our developer funding maximum, so that a single developer now is eligible to receive up to $40 million or up to $60 million in funds, whereas previously at $40 million, keeping consistent that amount that's at a scale of 2 maximum awards. So we've made a number of references to our project area. We are going to ask that you upload a project area map that details what your project area looks like, but I'm just going to get into what this project area or how this is actually calculated. And just stay tuned as all these resources, including the final climate adaptation matrix and narrative rubric, project area mapping guidance also will be posted over the next week or 2 as we are on the road at our application workshops. So to begin with, in drawing your project area, you'll put both your affordable housing development and your affordable and your qualifying transit station stop on the map. So you can see that blue rail symbol is our qualifying transit stop. That qualifying transit stop will then create a 1 mile buffer around the area. So that's our initial project area. You can also see STI improvements being new bike lanes in red and new sidewalk in green. So with these STI improvements, we're going to create a half-mile buffer around those. So this disappeared, that 1 mile buffer around the qualifying transit station and stop, but we actually bring that back in so that these two areas are merged. So you have the half-mile around the STI infrastructure, and then also that 1 mile around the qualifying transit station and stop. You'll notice that there's also key destinations listed on the map, which you are going to ask that you do, though those do not increase your project area buffer by any means. We also have net density calculations in AHSC. So Coral covered our minimum densities, though, as she also mentioned, we encourage you all to pursue even denser developments. But how these are calculated also accounts for a couple deductible spaces. So it's not just your total plot size necessarily. So our allowed deductible areas are essentially any public lands, sidewalks, open spaces, public drainage, public parks, setbacks, utility easements, driveways, just general landscaping. Those are not eligible as deductible areas. So an example of a project, it's 100 units, it's a 20-acre or a 5-acre site for an initial density of 20 units per acre. But then we take into account different deductible areas, the public right-of-way, the sidewalk, public drainage, a public park. The net site now is 3 acres, increasing density from 28 units per acre to 33 units per acre. So the AHSC application, this is the main document on which your AHSC funding request will be based. This can be found, as we mentioned, it's going to be posted later this week, found on the HCD website. So if you go to Housing Community Development's website and click on their grants funding, or if you just search online for HCD AHSC, you should find it fairly quickly. You'll get to a page with a number of different resources, including links to the guidelines, which will take you to the SGC website. You can see the NOFA itself and requirements laid out within there about how to submit an application. Then you'll also notice there are program forms online, and we'll get into a little bit of these as well. And also to mention, obviously, the AHSC application can be found on this webpage. It's worth noting too that there are 2 workbooks that you'll have to be submitting as part of this AHSC total application. So that includes the AHSC specific workbook, but also the HCD general application or the universal application. So both are required of AHSC. In order to submit your application materials, you'll have to create an account or use your existing account on the FAST website. As I mentioned, you can go to the SGC webpage in order to get instructions on how to access FAST, where you can also see all previous applications to the program. Some notes about the universal and AHSC application. As I mentioned, they're both required. There are a lot of cells within the workbooks, but only complete the yellow shaded cells. Other cells are either locks or relying on macros that will auto-populate. Speaking of macros, you should get a warning when you open the workbook that there are macros, and we need you to enable those macros in order for a fully functioning workbook. We also ask that you do not copy and paste any information into these workbooks. Even if you have a previous round's application you'll be utilizing, a lot of these cells are using macros, and previous workbooks may have done the same as well. So please we ask that you write that information in anew. Also complete the tabs in order, beginning with the overview workbook. That overview workbook will have a number of upfront questions that will then determine what the rest of your workbook will look like. So in the overview tab, there's a couple questions that we'll go into. And finally, in the AHSC application, there are orange cells shaded. These signify that you need an upload, a fast upload. We also have an uploads checklist provided in the application where you can verify whether or not you've uploaded all of our mandatory documents. As I mentioned, you can go on the HCD website to download these applications. So here's an overview tab from the AHSC workbook. A couple of things you'll notice in the top right, selecting your project area type will then determine a couple of other subsequent numbers on there, on the workbook. Also, you'll need to check the boxes for each project component included in your AHSC project, as those tabs will only appear once you check those boxes. You'll also notice there are little red flags across the workbook. Definitely hover over those red flags, those little red corners in the top right corner of the cells. Those will pop up with some comments that might be helpful for you all. And if you see a red number or a red cell there, that means that there's something happening there or some possible eligibility criteria that might be going awry. So definitely something to be wary of. Our AHSC application, so our threshold requirements, you'll notice here a completed CARB calculator tool or AHSC calculator tool is required for eligibility. Here's a look at the upload checklist. So you'll notice here that this top cell says a wet signature is required. AHSC projects no longer have to submit their application workbooks in paper, though what we are still asking that anything that requires a wet signature, we need a hard copy of. Everything else can be submitted through the FAST online portal. So one of the big goals for awarded projects is to get our standard agreements or our contract signed within 90 days of award. One of the big contributing factors to this is how accurate forms that are submitted with the application are. So we're just going to get into a couple different pieces of advice for submitting properly filled out forms. So the names of the organizations and the legal names must be consistent across documents, and particularly for the certificate of good standing. Authorized representatives, all these documents, we really just need accurate forms, because if anything is inaccurate, then there's going to be longer dialogue, recognizing that many different documents and forms require third parties or boards or public entities that may not convene very often to issue them, which can then just slow down the whole disbursement of funds on the back end. So TIN form, you can find this document on the HCD website, but you'll notice a couple of different forms that we really need that correct information filled out, and these forms and these slides will all be posted online, so you can go through these notes in more detail at that point. Payee data record, you'll see a lot of musts on here. Essentially, this comes down to accuracy of the form again. Our authorizing resolutions is often a common point of where we see a couple of discrepancies among awarded projects. So there is a template posted on the HCD website. There's within that template a number of different necessary measures that need to be included. So while your project does not need to use the HCD template, it must include all of the same aspects of the HCD template authorizing resolution. So the entity's name, the authorized representative, where we need the title, otherwise the name of the person must be on a piece of verified letterhead saying they're within that title, and then all of these additional requirements as well. Some more requirements of what all must be included on the authorizing resolution. Couple notes about some things you'll want to reference while drafting up that authorizing resolution. And as I mentioned, these slides will be posted online where you can dive a little bit more into this detail, but definitely please refer to these slides when creating your authorizing resolution for the project. And so now I'm going to hand off the mic to our colleague Layla Atalla at the Air Resources Board to go over the quantification methodology.
Good morning, my name is Layla Atalla. I'm at the California Air Resources Board and I work with SGC and HCD staff on the AHSC program, primarily on the quantification methodology and AHSC benefits calculator tool, which I'll go over briefly today. CARB's role with the AHSC program is primarily to provide guidance on how to estimate the benefits of AHSC projects. And for that purpose, we create the AHSC benefits calculator tool, which uses project-specific inputs to estimate greenhouse gas emission reductions and co-benefits associated with proposed projects. The co-benefits are largely estimated using the same information required to estimate greenhouse gas emission reductions, all using that same AHSC benefits calculator tool. And you can see that a variety of co-benefits, including travel and energy and fuel cost savings, fossil fuel use reductions, and other emissions reductions, are estimated using the tool, but only greenhouse gas emission reductions are used to score projects according to the AHSC guidelines. The AHSC benefits calculator tool and quantification methodology are organized by project component. A project is made up of multiple components, which in this table are listed on the left-hand column. And for each of those components, there's a different tab of the AHSC benefits calculator tool, including affordable housing, solar, active transportation, and transit components. The applicants will need to use those different tabs of the calculator tool depending on what kinds of project components they have. And in one case, projects including solar PV, there's one third-party tool, the PV Watts calculator tool, which applicants will use to generate inputs to the AHSC benefits calculator tool. This is just a screenshot of the AHSC benefits calculator tool housing tab, and you'll see that there's a link highlighted in yellow that takes applicants to the user guide for the AHSC benefits calculator tool. We'll go over that shortly, but the calculator tool is Excel-based and it uses applicant inputs to estimate greenhouse gas emission reductions and co-benefits. Again, there are tabs for each project component and a documentation checklist tab at the end. That tab is an aid only. Applicants should refer to the AHSC application workbook for full information about required documentation. Two documents, the AHSC user guide on the left and the quantification methodology on the right, support the benefits calculator tool. The user guide includes step-by-step instructions on how to fill out the tool. It also has a project example showing how the tool is used. The quantification methodology contains details on the equations and data underlying the benefits calculator tool. So if you have questions about how to use the tool, the user guide should be the first stop. For questions about what's going on in the tool, the quantification methodology is the first stop. The quantification methodology describes the updates that we make to the calculator tool for round 5. CARB staff regularly review benefits calculator tools and quantification methodologies to incorporate new research and data and align with changes to the AHSC program guidelines. For round 5, there are a few key changes. One of the main ones is that the benefits calculator tool now includes equations to estimate avoided vehicle miles traveled from affordable housing developments. CalEMOD is no longer used as an external tool as part of the quantification methodology. In addition, there are updated underlying data describing trip lengths, both residential and transit emissions factors for transit vehicles and passenger autos, and updated information on parking rates and transit dependency adjustment factors. In addition, the length of time for which we calculate co-benefit criteria and toxic air pollutant emission reductions is now extended for projects that have a useful life that goes on past 2050. And electric bike share is now quantifiable using the benefits calculator tool, as opposed to bike share only using traditional bicycles. And finally, the project example in the user guide is expanded to address some frequently asked questions. As I mentioned before, there's one external tool that applicants might need to use depending on their project components. The PV Watts calculator is a web-based tool from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that applicants with a solar photovoltaic aspect to their project can use to estimate annual electricity generation from solar, and then input that information into the benefits calculator tool. So now I'm going to go over just the overview of the steps to quantify the emissions reductions and co-benefits of a project at a high level. The first step is to use the AHSC benefits calculator tool to enter basic project information on the project info tab. That includes contact information for the person filling out the tool, as well as information about project funding. And when completing that step, applicants can refer to the user guide for details on the inputs that are needed to that tab. Next, applicants will refer to the user guide to determine which other tabs they need to use based on their project components. And that goes back to that table that we looked at that shows the applicable tabs and, if necessary, third-party tools per project component. For each project component and tab, there's a table in the user guide listing all of the project-specific information applicants will need to collect. Steps 3 through 4 are all component-specific based on whatever the applicant identified as their applicable project components. They'll need to use the affordable housing, transit, and active transportation tabs of the AHSC benefits calculator tool to describe those components and estimate greenhouse gas emission reductions and co-benefits. One thing to note on each of those tabs is that there's a summary section that shows the benefits of the component, just the affordable housing or transit or active transportation component. And one way to make sure that the information that's necessary has been input correctly is to make sure that that summary is populating fully on that tab. So when you're completing one of those tabs, you should be able to see a summary of all of the co-benefits and emissions reductions from that component. And if there are blanks or errors, that lets you know that something is missing on that tab. Step 6 is for projects that have a solar PV component, and step 6 has 2 parts. First, we need to use the PV Watts calculator tool online to estimate annual solar PV electricity generation, and then input that annual number into the AHSC benefits calculator tool to estimate greenhouse gas emission reductions and co-benefits over the useful life of the solar PV system. Finally, the applicants should refer to the GHG summary and co-benefit summary tabs of the AHSC calculator tool to check that all of the summary information there is populated. Again, if there are errors or blank cells, that's a reminder to go back to steps 1 through 6 and make sure that all of the information has been entered correctly. Both of those summary tabs will show project benefits for the entirety of the project and for the portion of the project that's attributable just to AHSC funding. So for example, if a project had leveraged funding from another California climate investment program that made up, a third, let's say, of the total project funding, the benefits would be prorated by that portion that's just from AHSC funding to avoid double counting emissions reductions. The last step is to refer to the documentation tab of the AHSC benefits calculator tool, which shows required documentation both for all projects and for specific project components. Make sure that all of the necessary information is submitted so that someone else could replicate and review the benefits calculations. Again, that documentation tab is just a guide, and the AHSC application workbook is the final resource for all information about supporting documentation, including what to name the files and how to upload them to the FAST system. All of the AHSC quantification materials are available at the www.arb.ca.gov/CCI resources site. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the transportation and sustainable community sections on that site, you'll find the AHSC quantification methodology and benefits calculator tool. And the user guide is available through a link in the calculator tool. Throughout the solicitation period, this site will be updated with frequently asked questions as they're received, so you can check back at this resources site for further guidance. And if you have questions or comments after reviewing the quantification methodology and using the benefits calculator tool, you can submit those throughout the solicitation period to ggrfprogram@arb.ca.gov. And now I'll pass off the mic to our SGC colleagues.
All right, everybody, this is Cora again from SGC, here to kind of close this out. So I want to make sure to go over our application review process really quickly for everybody to get a sense of that timeline in more detail and what it looks like. So the application and NOFA are being put out very shortly, and then we will have that time for you all to apply. This is kind of the pre-application period, consists of these workshops that we're holding where there's opportunities to have consultations at the physical in-person workshops with staff to discuss your project and make sure you get clarification on any questions you have about whether your project will qualify, for example. And also the period of time where direct technical assistance is delivered. And then when the application period closes, staff will go through threshold review. This is looking to make sure that all projects are meeting thresholds. Everything is in place that needs to be at the time of application submittal. There is a 5-day appeal period after receiving your eligibility letter. If your project gets disqualified, you can appeal that. And then staff will go through a quantitative review process, looking at those quantitative policy scores, and the staff at the Air Resources Board will be looking at the benefits calculator tool to determine the ranking and binning for those projects. This will also have an appeal period of 5 days for each of the quantitative policy scores, as well as the points associated with your vehicle miles traveled reduction and your overall greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Only the top performing applications will move on to narrative review. We have a threshold that at least half of the 85 points that are scored at that time have to be received in order to move on to narrative review. So almost everybody passes through that step. And then finally, we do have the narrative review. As Ryan mentioned, this cannot be appealed. Those final 15 points are decided on at the same time as staff goes through the process of ensuring financial feasibility. And then once all of that is over, the final rating and ranking and the final binning for scoring will be completed, and award recommendations will be made based off of those final scores. So as you can see here, we do want to make sure folks know that there is an opportunity to appeal at threshold. if you find that your project you think has been unfairly disqualified. So as we mentioned, we are now in the workshop period, and applications will be due February 11th, so it's a good time to get started on your project. We do want to provide a little more information for you to look at resources. Obviously, this program, as you can see, is pretty complex, and an hour and a half doesn't fully cover everything that you need to know. So we have a lot of additional information on our website. We have a Q&A from previous rounds that will also be updated this round as we received questions with frequently asked questions. And if you do have questions that weren't covered here or aren't covered by these other resources on the website, you can email the AHSC inbox at AHSC@SGC.CA.GOV. And we have a new actual email for the CARB stuff. It's ggrfprogram@arb.ca.gov, so we'll make sure to update that before we send these slides out. You can also sign up for the AHSC listserv on our SGC website to get any news or notifications. We really encourage you to do that. You can also look at previous applications through the FAST portal. The public search tool allows you to look at all previously submitted applications. So for example, you can go to round 4, search for projects that were awarded in round 4 and really get into the details of what they did. And then of course we have our guidelines up there, which are, you know, the go-to resource for anything you don't understand. Try to find it in the guidelines first, and then go through some of these other resources and reach out to us if the guidelines don't clarify that. We also offer technical assistance. Right now we're in the direct application assistance period. We are in the process of selecting recipients for technical assistance. There's a survey that we put out a few weeks back. We are taking those applications on a rolling basis, so if you haven't submitted yet and you would like technical assistance, we encourage you to fill it out. We will send around follow-up email and can make sure to include that survey in that. And then outside of the application period, the technical assistance also focuses on capacity building. So if your project isn't ready for this round, but you maybe have 1 or 2 or a whole bunch of projects that you're thinking about for future rounds, our technical assistance providers can help with that. They are really great at helping to form the required partnerships for application, helping to select a competitive application scope, those different components that you need, greenhouse gas calculations, and budgets and finance, helping you work all that out. And in addition to all this, some of our technical assistance providers from round 4 created kind of an application toolkit that include resources on how to tackle a lot of different components of the program. Specifically, there are a few really helpful ones around the narrative. So the community climate resiliency and community engagement component, but also how to really think strategically about anti-displacement strategies, workforce development, and urban greening. So we really encourage you to take a look. It's linked in the PowerPoint, and we can also send that out later. So with that, we know this says breakout, but there's nowhere to break out to. So we would ask that you send us questions either through the chat or the question box. If you have any, thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope this was helpful, and feel free to send any questions that you have to us now or through the inbox. And we are looking forward to having you all participate in round 5 of the program and seeing your applications come through in February. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and mute the mic and we'll start to answer in the chat box itself. Thanks, everyone.